Okay, here's the bad news. One day, you're gonna die. And what may be worse is that your death may be the literal end of you, the literal end of your existence. And it's natural to wonder, would that be a bad thing? Or could there be cases in which your death would be a good thing, or at least wouldn't be a bad thing, even if it really did mean that your death was the literal end of you? Now, one way we like to think about whether or not our death would be a bad thing or how valuable our lives are from our own perspective is to ask questions like, well, what would I do if I were going to die in, say, 6 months? Would you quit your job? Would you reconnect with old friends? Would you go on a trip that you've always been meaning to plan, but you just keep putting off? We think about questions like, what would we do if we were going to die in 6 months? Because these are questions that help us really think about what actually makes our lives meaningful. In a lot of cases, people who find out that they only have 3 or 6 months to live or a year to live, they make drastic changes to their own lives. They quit their jobs. They travel to places that they've always wanted to see. They reconnect or make sure that they spend time with family and friends and people they care about. They get right with their various faith traditions. And yeah, taking the time to sit back and think about your own death and your own mortality is not exactly the cheeriest thing that you could do with your time, but it really drives home what's actually important, what's intrinsically valuable in our own lives. For example, people who quit their jobs because they only have 6 months to live, they're doing that precisely because their jobs are not important. They are not intrinsically valuable. They're only a means to an end. But people who decide that they're going to take a once-in-a-lifetime trip or get right with their faith tradition or spend time with their family and friends, they're doing those things precisely because those activities are so valuable. And for that reason, thinking about our own mortality, thinking about the fact that we're going to die, it can have a really clarifying effect on figuring out what really is intrinsically valuable, what really motivates at least us, and possibly what should motivate other people. Now, to think about this, I want to think about death from a very particular perspective. I want to think about death as the literal end of our existence. Imagine that when you die, you cease to exist. Now, obviously, this isn't the view of death that every faith tradition has. Many faith traditions, especially in Western monotheism, have a view of an immortal soul. And when you die, you are judged, or you go on to some sort of afterlife, or you are able to live on forever after your physical death. I'm not here to challenge those ideas. There's a really wonderful debate within philosophy, actually, about whether it's possible to survive your own death. I just unfortunately don't have time to wade into that debate here. If that is actually part of your faith tradition, that's wonderful. I would encourage you to take a look at the arguments in this video as a sort of hypothetical, as a mental exercise, as a what if. What if it were the case that my death would literally be the end of my own existence? What would that mean? What would that say about what's actually valuable in my life? And actually, the argument that I want to make in this video is the argument that if we were to die and literally stop existing, that would actually be really bad. It would be an incalculable loss for us. It would literally render our lives and our existence meaningless. And I understand it's kind of a downer, but I think starting off from this point will actually give us the opportunity to take a look at a few other viewpoints that are going to try to make the case that even if we were to stop existing, it would still be the case that our lives would have meaning, and we can start here as a sort of contrast point. And to do that, I want to take a look at a particular argument made by a particular philosopher, the American philosopher Don Marquis, who has a really wonderful argument for the idea that murder is wrong. What makes Marquis's argument really wonderful, I think, is the fact that he can provide a really compelling answer to the question why murder is wrong. And it has to do with, basically what you would lose. Now, once when I lived in Spain, my wife and my in-laws and I were out on the metro, and I caught some people trying to pickpocket my father-in-law. And, had they been successful, that would have been really bad. My father-in-law would have been in another country. He wouldn't have had his wallet. They probably would have taken his passport. It would have ruined the entire trip. It would have been a very serious loss on his part. But if you think about it, there are losses and there are losses. And losing your wallet and your passport, even if you're in a foreign country, can be a fairly significant loss. Being the victim of fraud and losing your life savings can be an even bigger loss. But Marquis thinks that the biggest loss that we can suffer is actually the loss of our own lives. And the reason that he thinks this is pretty straightforward. He thinks that if we were to lose our own lives, what we would actually lose would be all of our present experiences, all of our future plans, all of the experiences that we would have had, and also all of the memories of the past experiences that we really value. I mean, if I die, I can't go to the baseball game tomorrow because I'm dead. If I die, I can't play with my kids tomorrow because I'm dead. What makes Marquis's argument really wonderful is it not only explains why murder is wrong, it takes things that we value from us, but why it's the very worst thing that can happen to you. It robs you of literally everything that you value. Yeah, the pandemic sucks. I can't go to the baseball game. I can't see my friends and family as often as I would like, so on and so forth. But, hopefully one day the pandemic will end and we can go about something resembling our normal lives. Death, on the other hand, is forever. And if we die, and if death takes literally everything from us, if we lose everything that we care about, everything that we valued, everything that we accomplished, it doesn't matter what we did. We all wind up in the same spot. You could be the greatest person who ever lived. You could be a random person on the street. You could be the poorest, most forgotten person who ever lived. When you die, we all end up the same. And if we all end up the same, it doesn't matter what your choices are. Now wait, you might be saying, that's not actually the case. There are people that we remember, and we remember people that we care about and we're close to. When I die, you might be saying my family or my friends or my kids or my students or, history may remember who I am. You remember your grandparents. You remember Abraham Lincoln, Confucius, Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, Buddha, Mansa Musa, and so on. And, that's right. We will be remembered after we're gone, but think about the people who are going to be doing the remembering. They're going to die too. And maybe your memory will be carried forward through the people who remember them, but they're going to die, and so on and so forth until eventually the entire human race dies out and the heat death of the universe happens. And it doesn't matter what anybody did because we'll all end up in the same spot. Everybody's dead and there's no one around to remember us. There's no real effect that we had for good or ill on the universe. All of our choices are essentially meaningless. Now, I'll admit, this is really bleak to sit here and say, you might die and that might be the literal end of your existence, and the literal end of your existence might mean that your life is meaningless. That's not something that people necessarily want to hear, but I think it's something that is important to think about as we start thinking about this idea of what really is valuable and what really is most important in our own lives. The good news is there are actually a ton of arguments and a ton of philosophical positions where people are arguing explicitly against this idea. And I have some videos that are going to take a look at some of these different positions. Positions that say things like, we have the ability to choose what the meaning in our life is, or we have the ability to dedicate ourselves to something larger than ourselves that will give ourselves meaning. These are all wonderful positions and they may be true, but if we want to really take those positions seriously, I think the first thing that we need to do, the first sort of thing that we need to confront is actually the idea that our lives may actually be meaningless. So if you're feeling down right now, I understand that. Hopefully we'll have some videos soon where you'll be able to take a look at those and you'll be able to maybe find a philosophical position on your life, on your death, that might be a little bit more appealing. Oh, by the way, if you haven't heard of Mansa Musa, he's a really wonderful and fascinating historical figure. He was a 14th century king of Mali in Africa, and he was arguably the richest person who has ever lived. If you want to have an idea of how rich Mansa Musa was, consider this story. Mansa Musa was a Muslim, and that meant that as one of the 5 pillars of Islam, he had to make his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he did this. And along literally the entire route of his pilgrimage, he caused a currency crisis because he simply brought so much gold with him that he ruined the currencies of literally every town, kingdom, country, nation that he stopped in along the way. A conservative estimate of how much gold he brought with him on this trip was 57,000 pounds of gold for a trip from Mali to Mecca and back. It's a lot of gold. Oh, what's the heat death of the universe? The heat death of the universe is the point at which all matter in the universe reaches maximum entropy and all subatomic motion stops. Essentially, what happens is the universe freezes in place and nothing moves. In fact, nothing moves for the rest of time, to the point where physicists say that at that point, the concept of time no longer has any meaning at all. It's just going to end up how it's going to end up, and our choices don't have any impact on whether and how and when and what that state looks like when it actually happens. If you want to read a little bit more about that, there's a wonderful new book out by the astrophysicist Katie Mack called The End of Everything, Astrophysically Speaking. Really recommend that you check it out. It's a great book.